Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out to an inaugural moment in a series, what we hope is going to be a series of the IAWA Christine Fallon Prize. So today you're going to meet the first prize award winner. It's quite stunning, the whole spectrum of this. And I will introduce the benefactor of the prize award to you in a moment. But first, a few other things. You should know that this is part of the enterprise, if we can call it that, of the IAWA, which is the International Archive of Women in Architecture. And so this is an organization that is a cooperative effort between our college and the university libraries. It has a board that consists of an advisory board that consists of 5 faculty and 12 international advisors. 4 of them will be participating in our efforts in the next today and tomorrow. But in any case, to get back to why we're here to fill in the gap in history about women's contributions to the built environment. And so we have a special event, which is this prize. And I'd like to tell you a few things starting off, and then introduce you to this benefactor that I spoke about. In 2021, the IAWA was provided a grant to offer a $5,000 prize for a work that would identify an important contribution made by a woman in a large architectural firm, a woman whose work was largely or fundamentally unknown. Unknown, which means unknown to history, really. With research that documents this important information and is cognizant of the urgency of this effort. Because, and I think you'll hear this from our speaker today, the people you know and the stories they know are a tremendous value. You don't realize how valuable that is unless you make the connections to what that information is about. And there are people who do this in many ways, and you're going to meet one today. But in any case, so the IAWA Center called for proposals for the Christine Fallon Prize and projects in this round. And the final prize recognizes Erin Cayer as the 2022 Christine Fallon Prize recipient. So we know, thank you, Erin. So we know that we've had some hiccups in all different kinds. I use the word hiccups. It's like, where do hiccups come from? Some of these things we know where they come from, some we don't. But the prize is awarded for a best published or publication-ready manuscript that researches a woman or women who made significant contributions to the field through their work practicing in large firms in the second half of the 20th century. So if you think for a moment, you know what that means. These people are, I mean this honorifically in a way, these people hold some knowledge that will disappear unless it is rescued in some way. So today, I'm going to introduce to you the benefactor of this prize, but before I do, I'll give you a brief biography of Erin Cayer, who is with us this afternoon. He is Assistant Professor of Architecture History at the University of New Mexico, where his teaching and research focus on architecture firms, labor, and the urban political economy. He received his PhD in architecture from UCLA, as well as undergraduate and graduate degrees in architecture from Norwich University in Vermont. He knows very well some of our alumni from that last institution that I mentioned. And it's quite interesting to have conversations with him about this. His research about architecture firms and architectural education has appeared in numerous journals and edited volumes. He is the recipient of several recent research awards and fellowships, including the 2021 Barbara Thom Fellowship at the Huntington Library in California, where he worked to complete his first book, Conglomerators: How Architecture Firms Make, Manage, and Militarize the World. So, provocative title. He was named to the Architecture League of New York's American Roundtable in 2020, and he was most recently awarded the inaugural Christine Fallon Prize for research about women in corporate architecture firms by the International Archive of Women in Architecture in 2022. Okay. Now, to Christine Fallon, and I will let her introduce you more closely to Erin Cayer, because she is the benefactor, as I mentioned. She is also an alumni. She's related to you. She and herself has an incredible history. And I'll just stop here, she was in the early days of the digital design world, if we can say that, at the large US firm, international firm, Skidmore, Owens & Merrill. So I'm passing the microphone to Christine, if you want to stand there.
Oh, I can stand here. Okay, very good. Hello. I'm so happy to see so many people here today. Welcome. I'm very excited that Aaron's chapter is the first prize winner, because I think it sort of touches on almost everything we were thinking about when we conceived of the prize. This is a woman you never heard of, first of all. Second, her work was not in architectural design. It was sort of pushed to the periphery of practice, and yet she became an important executive in this major firm, and then was promptly forgotten. Aaron talks about the importance of capturing the facts so that architectural history is actually accurate. He talks about ways in which these facts become obscured for a variety of reasons, and that's a very interesting part of his chapter. And finally, he's developed techniques for ferreting out this information that are fascinating. So I'm hoping today he'll talk about all of that. Thank you very much, Aaron.
All right, can everyone hear me? I'm gonna turn this one off. Say what? I think so. Can you hear me? Good, all right. Excellent, good afternoon, and thanks everyone for joining. I'd like to begin by extending a special thanks to the IAWA team, including Donna and Sharon, for their organization and invitation, and to Christine Fallon, of course, for being here and for sponsoring such an important prize. I'm going to talk today a little bit about this particular chapter of a book that I'm just finishing about the history of corporate architecture firms during the 20th century. And in it, I explore how firms and how people, rather than buildings, provide us with a better lens through which to study architecture's relationship to political economy. So in the book, I trace the history of one corporate architecture firm, now known as AECOM, which you may have heard about, from its beginning as a 3-person architecture partnership in 1946 to its current position as a powerful multinational corporate conglomerate. So before I dive into the particular chapter in which I investigate the role of women within the firm, I thought I would start by sharing a bit about how I became interested in AECOM in the first place. So I moved to Los Angeles in 2012, and as I was walking through the downtown of LA for the first time, I was looking up and reading the business names that were affixed to the tops of the tallest towers. One stood out amongst them. So I was reading Union Bank, US Bank, CTBC Bank, Citibank, City National Bank, Manufacturers Bank, Open Bank, and then AECOM. What was AECOM? So I went home and I browsed their website, and the firm was a Fortune 500 architecture and engineering company with more revenue than any other publicly listed company in Los Angeles at the time. It was rivaled only by Walt Disney Company next door in Burbank. And for comparison, the firm itself had more capital than 97 countries worldwide. It rented offices in as many nations as the UN. And with nearly 100,000 employees, more people worked there than lived in 98% of American cities. And so I began to wonder, like later critics, how had AECOM become so big yet so quietly embedded in a sea of financial institutions? What did architects do there? And could we still consider them ethical professionals if they were fundamentally driven by growth and profit? So AECOM listed 28 services across nearly 50, quote, subsidiary firms on its website: architecture and design, IT and cybersecurity, finance, strategy plus, public-private partnerships. What didn't the company do, I kept asking myself. In one division of the firm, architects had recently finished designing a new headquarters for the LA Police Department. In a second division, architects were helping to train Afghans for combat. In another, architects were writing legal code as part of a new master plan for Kigali in Rwanda. And so further, how and why were architects involved in these radically different muscles of colonial governance? Who were these people? The business leaders, the records managers, the politicians, executives, engineers, and architects working and making the decisions within the firm. The first day I visited AECOM, here's their lobby in 2015, I met a receptionist whose head was blocked by a computer screen. And I introduced myself as an architectural historian to a senior director later that day, and I was interrupted mid-sentence. "Architecture history?" she asked me. "Then why are you interested in researching us?" As if I sort of offended her. And I was sort of stunned, since I had learned that the firm was started by 3 architects. The A in AECOM means architecture. It was founded by these founding partners, Philip Daniel, Arthur Mann, Kenneth Johnson in 1946. They were later joined by an engineer, Irvin Mendenhall, to form this company known as DMJM, or DimJim as people called it, in LA before they became AECOM in 1990. I also learned that the firm grew by engaging with very large military commissions and public works commissions, such as the US's first underground intercontinental ballistic missile prototype. Funny enough, one of the colleagues of the DimJim founders was a set designer who went to architecture school at USC and did this rendering, Jack Martin Smith, and he was also the same person who did the illustrations for The Wizard of Oz. So there's this interesting connection between corporate architecture firms and Hollywood. But they also grew by acquiring and merging with a diverse array of firms to sort of keep up with the demands of the post-war economy. And DimJim emerged as a sort of firm with many firms within it, known as a corporate conglomerate by the 1980s. And it included subsidiaries that were not only in architecture and engineering, but also firms ranging in service from real estate to data processing to even cosmic X-rays. that's a whole nother story. Many of which were developed for projects that were initiated by the federal government during the Cold War. So to dig more deeply into the history of the firm, I started sending requests for access to AECOM and DIMJIM's private archives in their firm, or in their office, which were met by enthusiasm and interest by the firm's CEO and the COO and its president, as you can see here from this first email exchange. Very excited, thanks again, good stuff. However, after negotiations with the firm's legal counsel, their attorneys, for about a year, I was denied archival access to their firm. And the counsel suggested that the rights of access to the firm's drawings and documents were determined not by AECOM, but by the clients that funded them, suggesting that a funding of a project or the government's classification systems imposed upon them trumped the rights of an architect or an engineer to her work. So paperwork and drawings were microfilmed at DIMJIM during the late 1980s and 1990s, and all of the records were stored and subsequently sealed off from public access. They are now all stored in an off-site vault in 4,600 unlabeled boxes, I should add, in a private storage company known as Iron Mountain. So they don't even know what's in those boxes or where they are. They're sort of all scattered everywhere. Yet as historians and theorists of architecture and philosophy and science remind us, from Jacques Derrida to Beatrice Calomina to Mark Wigley, an archive is dependent upon public access. So an archive, sociologist and historian Michael Lynch describes, though, quote, "Though guarded is a public space, it is not a private collection locked in an inaccessible vault," end quote. Yet what happens if and when an architecture firm's archive is completely inaccessible? And so as I tried to answer this question, one particular name at AECOM surfaced over and over as I was asking more about the archives and archival protocols: Carol Ann Bakeman. So Bakeman was hired in 1969 and became AECOM's chief librarian and records manager until she was ousted in 2003 when she turned 70 years old. It was also the same time that AECOM's archives were sealed up. In 1988, she prepared a report about the archiving procedures and records management technologies of large architecture firms, and in it she wrote that, quote, "The future of DIMJIM is dependent on knowledge of its past work," end quote. Yet the more I learned, the more I could see that Bakeman's note corresponded with a broader fear of loss during the Cold War, a loss of history, a loss of life, a loss of legacy, that prompted the government and industrial organizations to begin systematically archiving their records and classifying as secret those that they considered to challenge their sovereignty. And so during the 1970s, an emerging regime of secrecy was reinforced by gender divisions of labor. While DIMJIM was formed by men who secured government tools and contracts as they competed for government work, the company began to hire an increasing number of women in response to their own fears of loss. First as secretaries, as librarians, as records managers, and data processors, women were hired to maintain and reproduce the records of the firm. And while these gender divisions of productive and reproductive architectural labor have been well critiqued and problematized within recent architecture scholarship, the goal of my questions was to learn about the ways that the Cold War was actually reshaping architecture practice and architecture more broadly. And while gender and racial inequalities across the profession to this day remain only marginally improved since the 1970s, conglomerate architecture firms in the US disproportionately employed more women than smaller firms by the 1970s. To be sure, DIMJIM was a firm that was dominated by men, and virtually no women entered the tiers of administration prior to the 1990s, as is depicted by one of many professional council retreat photographs, which they love to share, such as this one in California in 1974. Yet within this so-called man's world was Bakeman, who was a self-made librarian who began her career at the Hughes Aircraft Company, where she worked at the library, even though she couldn't write shorthand notes and she didn't know how to type. So she took advantage of a local typing training program, and by the time she left, she was the head of the research department. She was hired as a part-time librarian in 1969 by the DIMGIM Economics Division. I think it's important to recognize that the relationship between archiving and economics at this time. And during her career, she was appointed as a corporate librarian in 1971, and later the manager of information and office services in 1979. Bakeman's initial task at DIMGIM was to catalog and make accessible the, quote, in-house records of the firm and to establish an in-house company archive. The scope of her work increased throughout her career along gendered lines of what was described as housekeeping, all without a pay increase. So in addition to supporting her husband and her 2 daughters at home, she managed the firm's travel arrangements, the executive dining room, telecommunications, the fleet of cars, and all house furniture and their space plans in the office. And journal articles and newspapers celebrated Bakeman's housework, the work historically associated with this unwaged, quote, labor of love of the domestic sphere, for its prominence within this so-called man's world of waged work. Here's an example of a letter that she sent after getting all of these assignments over the years, another task, another task, another task, all without a pay raise. This is a letter that she wrote the executives asking for the first raise since she started in the 1960s. So by the 1960s, however, the Cold War had come to represent debate about power, ideology, and control over the narrative of the nation's past and future. And the act of rendering a record of the past a secret was supported in law by a, quote, housekeeping privilege, a 1789 federal statute that was reaffirmed in 1958 as a law that grants certain government executives and secretaries with the authority to release or withhold records about the country's past. And it's still used today. The housekeeping privilege and the housekeeping statute is what they often refer to when they argue that they can't release public information. One could and still can invoke the housekeeping privilege to prevent government records, as I mentioned, from becoming public. But more specifically, the housekeeping statute granted the secretaries of executive departments with the collective authority to regulate, quote, the custody, use, and preservation of the records, papers, and property appertaining to it. While the statute was intended to protect records, it was increasingly invoked as a means to restrict access altogether. And so this uniting of material conditions, the governmental sort of keeping of the house, a phrase that we often hear in politics, was historically constructed through architecture. So in Derrida's 1994 lecture, Archive Fever, he argues that it provides a brief account of earliest archives within Greek city-states, and he describes how official documents were stored in private houses of those who made or represented the law. But importantly, public access to these private houses was paramount, and thus while they were regarded, the archive was still historically defined as a public space. Citing Derrida, quote, one can always dream or speculate about the secret account, but speculation begins there and belief. But of the secret itself, there can be no archive by definition, end quote. And so at DIMGIM, Bakeman was granted top secret government clearance by the federal government in 1961. Here's her application, all of her fingerprints. Her daughter said it's okay to share these, so yeah. Her clearance enabled her to work as DIMGIM's facility security officer, which was a position that was required by governments for contractors. So this status made her one of DIMGIM's official housekeepers in the eyes of the government. And so not only was she maintaining and reproducing the firm's history, she was also maintaining and reproducing a history of the United States. In 1988, Bakeman surveyed the record-keeping procedures and technologies at large architecture firms as part of a housekeeping assignment in order to make recommendations to the firm, at the time, DimJim. So she studied firms like the Architects Collaborative, William Pereira Associates, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and others, where she found that hard copies of most project files, calculations and speculations, were microfilmed and then tossed out. Most of the sort of boring documents of practice that I find super interesting. Hand drawings were treated very carefully and very differently, however. They were microfilmed and then maintained carefully in storage. And so in addition to researching procedures, she surveyed the technologies that were used by banking and insurance companies whose revenues were based on economies of loss. Western Mortgage, Innkeepers Dorman, Western Federal, and Pennsylvania Life Insurance Company. Here are some of her notes from that work. And despite the sort of anonymous culture and breadth of practice of these very large firms, the record-keeping protocols reveal how long-standing values of the individual hand drawing by men were being challenged by the mechanical reproduction and by this work known as housekeeping. So for the Architects Collaborative, Bakeman notes, quote, "They don't trust scale on bringing back drawings from 35 millimeter. They check their original drawings against all others." End quote. And this was similar to other large firms, including CRS in Houston and Pereira Associates in Los Angeles. At Pereira's office, where they were, quote, "trying to keep everything forever," until they ran out of space. They tried microfilming, but they, quote, "didn't like reproduce copies." They tried reducing drawings, but they still didn't like the copies. And bringing back to accurate scale was a problem, she writes. In contrast, individual men architects with their own firms often resorted to more extreme acts of destruction, obsessively self-selecting and destroying. Peter Eisenman's archival protocol, for example, revealed a desire to appear self-designed. Quote, Eisenman argues, "We do not do any selection," he writes. "And when it overwhelms us, we just put everything into storage," end quote. However, his primary archives at the CCA, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, reveal a slightly different story. The archival record for House 1, for example, includes mostly drawings and very few documents. So many of his drawings were produced by hand, and he autographed them as they were being archived at the request of the institution, he claims, which exposed his desire to appear self-designed rather than designed by others, such as a state or a military or a bureaucracy. And this is not unlike the archival violence, I think, described by other architects and architectural historians, including Adolf Loos, who notably destroyed all of his documents in his studio, and he argued that, quote, "the gentleman is a man who only carries out work with the help of destruction." But Bakeman's housekeeping at home did not necessarily influence her housekeeping at the office, as newsletters and journals implied. Instead, the procedures of her housekeeping at the office, and therefore the procedures of the state, influenced her housekeeping at home. So like at the office, Bakeman's role was to classify and separate the documents of family events in order to organize the narrative about the family's past. So while Bakeman unfortunately passed away in 2017, one of her daughters describes her mother's work in this way. "Rather than run the workplace as she would home, she more ran the home as she would her workplace. In going through my parents' belongings, there are no less than 15 large cases of slides, each slide numbered. With them is a file card box, alphabetized by name or place. For instance, if I wanted to see pictures of my sister, I can look under D for Debbie and see pictures of my sister throughout her life. The Debbie card has numbers and events listed, so I can even narrow it down to her 8th birthday. This continues for every member of the family, every place we went, etc. It is amazing." And the trajectory of Bakeman's career from the Hughes Aircraft Company to DimJim characterizes a broader trajectory of women working within post-war corporate architecture firms more broadly. So women architects reported higher rates of employment, as I mentioned, with government jobs than men during the 1970s. And since many large firms, large architecture firms, were closely aligned and or were working with the government, their disproportional employment by large architecture firms was unsurprising. Norma Sklaric, who was the first African-American woman licensed to practice architecture in the United States, as you likely know, was rejected by a dozen architecture firms, small architecture firms, until she was finally hired by the New York Department of Public Works in 1950, after which SOM hired her in 1955. In LA, Zelma Wilson, whose collections are actually here, was hired by Dim Jim in 1948 after first working for the LA City Planning Department. And Zelma Wilson was actually the first woman to be hired at Dim Jim, and I'm excited to learn more about her archives here. By the middle of the 1970s, large architecture firms of 50 or more employees disproportionately employed more women than small firms, despite representing less than 4% of architects across the US at the time. In surveys conducted by the AIA in 1975, women described never-ending discriminatory, quote, mental blocks in the minds of men, supervisors, architects, and business leaders who prevented them from entering firms as designers or as business leaders. Even as architects, women described their work as secret within the gentleman's profession. As Zelma Wilson argued, in those days, women architects were rare, and when there was a woman architect, it was kept a deep, dark secret. Julia Morgan did her drawings in the basement, and she designed 800 other buildings, including several on the Stanford campus, but she died unknown, alone, and penniless. For a female to say she wanted to be an architect, like Wilson at the time, was like saying, I want to walk on the moon, especially at Santa Rosa High School. Yes, I'm a Ventura County girl. By the 1970s, photographs of women at Dim Jim peppered public-facing annual reports and pamphlets and company brochures, though again, very few made their way into the ranks of administration. As business historian Louise Heyman has argued, a woman's work was considered, quote, a luxury by the 1970s standards. Her labor was viewed as temporary and her income supplemental. And at Dim Jim, the firm's corporate board of directors, all men, conducted a search in 1981 for a new member, and founding partner Art Mann proposed nominating a woman for the first time. He wrote to his colleague in a letter titled Dim Jim Board, quote, how about a top businesswoman? I don't have a name in mind, but a little research could turn up a lot of names. The Dim Jim Board needs a feminine touch. I got tired of the beady-eyed businessmen. How about a beady-eyed woman? The plus side, aside from the astute thinking, would be the PR effect. She need not be in the design or construction fields, just so long as she had business experience, end quote. So while this proposal by Mann was ultimately rejected by all of the other directors, it underscored the perceived role that women could play in the conglomerate architecture firm: public relations, facade, keeping the house, keeping the state. And one further example of this was a former architect who shared this sort of culture of what it was like to work there in the 70s. The first day I was there, someone literally asked me to make coffee. I said, no, I'm sorry, I didn't get a graduate degree in architecture for you to ask me to make coffee. You'll need to ask someone else. And she argued, and I remember when I was about 1 or 2 years in, looking out to the sea of white male engineers and thinking, wow, I'll never fit in. But she continues, but it was absolutely freeing because I didn't even have to try. And I kind of feel like for the most women who worked there, there was no attempt to be anything other than who they were. And so I guess it was almost a reaction to the culture rather than the culture being nourishing. So one further example of this work took place in the firm's executive dining room, at the firm's LA office, where the firm hosted private lunches and drinking events with the public guests, such as directors and various city departments. And I hear stories about that, there being a lot of alcohol involved in this business executive dining room. And one draftsperson at the time, one woman draftsperson, argued, "I remember the first time there was a woman guest, a woman who was very high up in the city, and she was invited in for a lunch, and it was hilarious to me because I got an invite to the corporate dining room. But I was normally just the third drafter to the left, and now they pretended I was way more special than that because they had a woman guest." Another woman architect argued that it was, in fact, the striking homogeneity of white men and the prominence of women secretaries during the 1970s that helped to produce exceptional women architects, those who Gwendolyn Wright has described as historically more anonymous, more tolerant of discrimination, and less recognized, while at the same time more dedicated and determined. And it was very common for women at DimGym to react to this striking homogeneity and form their own firms after some time, often leaving or sometimes being forced out, as was the case by Zelma Wilson, to lead nationally recognized design organizations, especially in public infrastructure or in government. Zelma Wilson was recognized as a pioneering architect who launched her own firm in 1967, and she was named an AIA Fellow in 1983. Kim Day was hired at DimGym during the 1970s and was the first woman architect to become a vice president at AECOM, though she left to become the executive director of the Los Angeles World Airports in 2003, and then the CEO of Denver International Airport in 2008, and she just recently retired. So perhaps another great one for the archives. Or Ellen Wright, who began working at DimGym in 1985 and was later named the director of the terminal design at LAX as well. Yet to access the records and archives of their histories is also to challenge the sort of predominant official history and legacy of the firm, which they often describe or publish, and which foregrounds the drawings of men and the legacies of men. And so in order to obtain documents and drawings and information related to AECOM's history, I had to follow paper trails rather than just attempt to gain access to their traditional archives. And so I deployed a technique that I describe as historical ethnography, which is framed by the anthropologists Jean and John Komaroff, who consider oral histories and interviews as well as archival documents as ethnographic documents that reveal layers of the past. And since the firm's founders and most employees from its earliest days have since passed away, I read and reconstructed narratives of loss in order to identify the firm's past employees. I identified the names of children and aunts and siblings and family members of former employees by reading many, many obituaries, such as Bakeman's, which I started to diagram and cross-reference with DimGym's records that I could access. And as I began drawing family trees, the sort of firm's web of geography and biography and the relationships between families became clearer. And sometimes, people gave me wrong names or they couldn't remember the spelling of a last name. And then you start to, find siblings who are on Facebook or on Instagram, and you can write to them, and then they say, do you want to talk to my mom or my grandma? So it's a very complex, but very sort of the moment form of research. And so contemporary social media was also very helpful in communicating with families, and so I turned to tools of digital social exchange, like not only email, but LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook. And I wrote cold letters sometimes to friends and colleagues and family members of DimGym's architects and business leaders. And often these notes led to dead ends, but in many cases, my inquiries were met by excited former employees of family members who were willing to share their stories or refer me to others. Some even mailed documents or boxes or invited me to dig through their binders and boxes of carefully preserved archival fragments. So a lot of closets, a lot of garages, a lot of spare bedrooms where a lot of these documents are still, piled high. There were other archives, however, that were far more restrictive in nature, such as the US Air Force or the CIA, where drawings and memos and documents associated with the firm's classified projects were located. These required the submission of over 25 Freedom of Information Act requests, as well as business entity record requests from states for their legal corporate documents of registration. Each agency required formal written requests that described in detail the particular document that you're looking for, its corresponding project, as well as its exact date of construction, to be determined without any finding aid or any knowledge if the file even exists. And then it takes about a year for the government to research, to declassify, redact, and then distribute the documents. And oftentimes, the reports were heavily redacted, or sometimes the government claimed to have no records of construction, even though, of course, the building exists. The CIA 213 building in Washington, D.C. was one that the government claims, the FBI claims they have no records of. And so oftentimes, heavily redacted or sometimes no documents at all. But on other times, the requests were very smooth. Oftentimes, these were construction documents or drawings, not the sort of documents of practice that we were just talking about. And sometimes they would deliver or send me an entire construction set, such as this one. It's a 1,000-page construction set for a ballistic missile facility in California. So if anyone's interested, I have a full construction set. So we can't get access to very, minute details of practice and contracts and, exchanges of letters and words, but, it's relatively easy to get access to ballistic missile facilities. I shouldn't tell anyone that I have this, but But in the end, really, the house reemerged as AECOM's archives, and thus the archive of the government. And so while housekeeping was still its reproductive labor, daughters of former DimJim founders and employees carefully and proudly shared and stored their boxes, binders, and folders and company drawings in their closets, attics, and garages, building on Bakeman's and keeping alive Bakeman's legacy. And my house quickly began to look like theirs, yet these sites were the firm's archives and the archives of the state. And thanks to these dozens of women, the firm's past was and is made accessible to the public, and the possibility of historical transformation or change, rather than merely reproducing the status quo, was and remains alive. So thank you so much. Maybe we have time for questions or no?
If anyone has any questions, I can come around.
Thank you. Can you share the table of contents of the whole book with us? Because this is a chapter, right?
Yes. And it should be out next year, so it's still almost there. But I would be happy to share the table of contents, yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. Could you expand upon a little bit more about the idea of the informal sort of archive, the thing that isn't labeled as an archive, which is people's personal lives or the things that they take home from the corporate firms that you're looking at, or kind of other workplaces or other things, and maybe expand upon how that may affect your research in the future, and also kind of where that train of thought leads you.
Great question. I think in some ways the so-called informal archive is where the documents of practice often are, like the sort of boring, like texts and email exchanges and letters and sometimes contracts, while the so-called official archives sort of privilege drawings. And so it's, I think, interesting to think about studying architecture and architectural history in both in terms of practice, but also in terms of, let's say, a profession, right, and where those documents end up. So I think it would be incredible to still preserve those documents in a sort of controlled environment, in a safe space, because there were floods in some of these garages that I was, this is, I think, also very reminiscent of discussions that we're having in our present moment and our, like classified documents found in a garage every other weekend or something, right? So taking care of those documents is still an important thing. And so I've been trying to get some of these documents into some other collections. So some have been moved to the Huntington Library in California. But I think part of that informality is what has allowed those documents to withstand the test of time. So it's sort of this interesting, like, it's great that they kept them and that they were in their garages and attics, but now I think it's important that we at least protect them and take care of them. So yeah, it's without losing them and without them becoming part of these large institutions and bureaucracy. So yeah, it's tricky.
Thanks again for your lecture. I was curious about, we know that there's more female architecture students than there are in practice. Did you look at the relationship in the past of female architecture students to more the housekeeping side or the architects that were in practice?
That's a great question. And I don't know that I have an answer. In terms of just data that was collected then, so looking at the data in government, there's records about what gendered divisions of work in government, and also surveys with the AIA. Within that survey, there are, I would have to go back and look, but there are breakdowns of what women were doing. How many were firm leaders, how many were architects, how many were neither. But it's interesting actually to think about like how that has changed today with relative to corporate practice versus, let's say, small firms. So it would be interesting to sort of update that study, I think. Maybe it already exists and I'm not aware of it. But beyond that, I don't have more detailed data about students, in part because this book or this chapter is just one piece of this overall project, but it's a really interesting question, and you're making me want to dig more deeply and think about the students or to think about the comparisons with school, because there was such an important connection, I think, with schools and institutions, and especially these large firms. So many of the women that started here were sort of firsts, like first in their school to graduate, first then to work in city government, then first to be in the, so there's a sort of history of firsts in this, but it's interesting for me to see how it goes from, let's say, the university to the government, then to these very large firms. So trying to trace that history has been tricky enough, but no, this added layer is really, it's and the feedback, like how then, once we have more women in practice, then how does that start to change architectural education, right? So it's not just a pipeline of one starts and then one ends, but it's a really great question. Yeah.
Hey, I have a friend, my coworker. He recently graduated from Norwich, and I'm wondering if that environment where there's a core and there's civilians, similar to Virginia Tech, if that separation of people and identity started to influence your research at all?
That's a really, really great question, and one that I've thought a lot about. And maybe it did in ways that I'm not aware. So I was at Norwich. And the architecture school is sort of this, they call it it's civilian lifestyle, and it's on the upper parade ground. It's surrounded by the core. And I never really thought much about the relationship between the military and architecture while I was studying undergrad and my master's there. And then I got to UCLA, and when I even start to think about these very large firms, I wasn't even thinking about the military as part of them. I just thought, how did these giant firms like Gensler and SOM and AECOM, how did they get so big? And I wasn't even thinking about the military at the time. And actually, it's through all of these crazy loops and hurdles that you have to dive through that you really get to the story, which is about the military. And you start to see, oh, because they were part of the or engaged with military work, they got then their first computers, the first computers within most architecture firms, these giant computers that would have filled up this whole space. And then that's how then they got these giant contracts. But I don't think that, or maybe the lens that I developed while I was at Norwich sort of, there's a sort of unspoken practice in the way that it sort of shaped my thinking, but not deliberately or not consciously. But it's a really great connection and one that I need to think more about because it's there. And I've actually presented this work at Norwich, and they're always like, oh, wait, your critique, anyway, the military critique, I think, is an important one but it's an important one to be, level about, yeah.
Hello, Aaron. I was wondering what you asked. You mentioned oral history being very important for your research, and I was wondering what you asked everyone you met and how you handled the interviews.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the oral histories became the most important part of reconstructing this history, because then they would say, oh, talk to this person, they're 98 years old, and go to this person's house, and go to, so I, all over, like so many houses and garages, but generally I just asked them to tell me about their story, how they started, how they got to, or where they went to school, how they got interested in architecture, how they got interested in working at the firm, and then they sort of take it from there. So every single oral history is very, very different, and it was a sort of feedback. So I would, have one conversation with them, I would transcribe that, I would share the notes with them to make sure that what they said was what they wanted to say, because sometimes they, oh my gosh, I said that, and oh, take that out of the record, right? Like one architect told me, oh, I really wanted to take over the world. And I was, okay. And so I wrote that down and I sent it back to him, and I said, here's what you said just to make sure. And he said, oh, looks great. And so, it was really confident about that expression. Was the co-founder of AECOM who said that. But going back and forth with everyone was really important, and then doing follow-ups. Sometimes I would have questions like, oh, you started to talk about this, and so even years later, I would go back and we would have another conversation. I would get new stories or learn more things. So it was a very sort of interesting feedback loop, but one that I wanted to make sure was very sensitive and careful. And so you'll notice that in the text or in the presentation, some women, I don't include their names. Some people, I don't include their names. I just assume anonymity unless they give me expressed consent to share their story and their name. So I think it's something to, borrowing from the sort of methods of ethnography, but thinking about it historically is one that I wanted to be really careful about, especially given the kind of work and the sort of the politics of the practice. But yeah, feedback loop, making sure that their words are what they wanted to say. And then even after I have written the book, I've sent chapters to these people to read, including Carolyn Bakeman's daughters and her family, and they shared notes and all kinds of other things, and so they're really proud of this history. So I want them to all feel proud of whatever I'm writing, even if it's critical. So I think that's, yeah. But some historians would probably say, that's not good history, right? Like, have to, distance yourself a little bit from that. But so trying to be objective, but also, convey these personal narratives in a clear and truthful way it's tricky.
do we still see practices like this happening in some degree today? And if so, how has it manifested itself, and what should we do about it?
By practices, do you mean the sort of archiving practices, or like the
Like
whatever AECOM?
the unseen heroes that go behind the scenes when they deserve plenty of credit for what they've done?
Yeah, I think no matter what, it's still happening, and it's still they're sort of invisible laborers or immaterial laborers, but perhaps slightly redefined. Like for example, when I first started trying to gain access to the archives, there was a woman who was the administrative assistant to the CEO. And so the CEO was not interested in talking to me, but the admin person was. And the admin person was the only person that had access to the archive. You know, everyone else was like, oh, I think there's some website, you have to like, I don't know, you have to have some special code. And so even that knowledge, right, like this one woman, the admin assistant, was the only person that knew how to access all of, like where all of these boxes were all over the world. Like, just incredible, and then she quit. But so yes, that sort of invisible labor does exist. I think it's more, it's interesting to see how it intersects with technology, I think, and the shifting protocols of the archive. But also, you know, I think, you know, thinking specifically about women, there are now, you know, women on the admin board and the corporate board of directors. But at the same time, I'm not claiming to have studied the contemporary version of AECOM, right? Like just looking at the history. So I don't know, you know, to do a full study of it in the present would require more, you know, an honest effort. My stories are mostly anecdotal, but yes, the longer.
Thank you.
Yeah. I can probably hear, but I guess no one else will be able to hear, so we'll wait. There's a question right here.
Thank you, Aaron. My question was, how has your research into Bakeman and AECOM influenced your teaching of architectural history?
Great question. So I actually teach professional practice. I also teach world history, you know, and I'm probably the only weird historian that teaches professional, like I just love professional practice. But one of the most important things to me in thinking about the role or the importance of history is to think about transformation. And so I think oftentimes we talk a lot about reproducing practice or like learning how to run a business and learning about contracts and ethics to, you know, to be a good professional and to stay alive as a business person. But we don't often talk about change. How do we actually change the profession? How do we change the practice? And oftentimes that requires history, right? Even the word practice, we love to use the word practice to mean everything, right? An architecture firm, a practice, like your actions, everything's a practice today. But we don't really talk about what practice is. Practice, right, through when the term was actually first defined during the 1970s at the same moment, it was this a reaction to this anxiety that we're like losing our access to the past, right? And so to understand a practice was to understand like how we came to be who we are, right? How, like, why do I like the kinds of designs that I like? Why do I do what I do? What, you know, all the conventions that we do. So to be able to study a practice, you sort of have to understand like how you got here. And so just that sort of like framing of professional practice and thinking then also about like, how did the profession come to be? How did all these firms come to be? And so introducing history even within, let's say, professional practice, but at the same time talking about a contract and about ethics and about all of these various facets that we talk about in architectural education. So trying to bridge the sort of, you know, the technical documents with like history and theory of what they, you know, imply. And I'm actually working on a curriculum with NCARB and ACSA right now with some of these modules, thinking about what is a profession, what is a practice, what is a firm, what's the difference between a corporation and a sole proprietorship historically, or even a cooperative or a union, all of these various different forms of organization, and how do they actually either encourage change, or in some cases they don't encourage change, right? Like a corporation is very different from a union. But I think it's important to understand the difference of those things and the different mechanisms and vehicles through which they operate. But yeah, so pro-prac is where it all happens, I think, in my teaching, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you.
And congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you.
I think you leave us with a lot to think about, and to think about how the practice of architecture design could be enriched by knowing more about what all folks do within these worlds. I mean, we could go on talking. I'll let you know, Aaron is here today. He's here tomorrow. In the afternoon, we will have 3 other speakers in the library. Two are in the audience now. One is Claire Boney from Basel, Switzerland. That's Claire. She's the first IAWA Milka Blishnikov Research Prize recipient when the prize was first initiated. And then she came back in 2015 to continue and present more of her work. We also have right behind her Anna Maria Pinzon. Her exhibition is in the lobby. It's 1 by 1. Please find out what 1 by 1 is all about. It's something for all of us. But anyway, thank you again.